Now here is the predilection and the revelation. You simultaneously have the diagnostic statistical manual, which forms a kind of stalactite structure over the vicissitudes of mind, and you can simply observe in the nexus of post-primordial space after the sequential mythology of cave dwellers has run its course, which, of course, the question is, will it ever? And then now we have to turn to the episodic parables of one E.O. Wilson, who regarded the following three patterns of inchoate human behavior as such. 1. We have the Paleolithic nervous systems, which arguably have not altered their basic mechanisms since the times of instinctual and necessary nomadism, of which we are seeing a resurgence. Secondarily, we have the so-called medieval institutions, which have been constructed by human beings in order to provide, on the surface, internally consistent structures whose only imbalance is that you have a majority of the population that simply knows absolutely nothing except the furrow and the plow and what's right in front of them. Okay, so therefore what we have to understand in order to fulfill judgment insofar as it is subjectively possible is to be able to strip away these layers of history and prehistory. Not necessarily to say don't dip your noses in the books because you want a grim outline of what was going on, but tertiarily not to neglect it either. So I hope that is food for thought. However, with these dithyrambs, if they are continuing, we have to overcome the axiom and the premise that simply because it is in the past that it is therefore inferior. Now, those of us above a certain striation of abstraction, you may find in the 21st century, many of us reverting to cliches, those which are not eternal, but those which are at least 200 to 250 years old. You may ask yourselves, well, why is this happening? And part of the answer is, it's happening because of everything that you didn't do. It's happening because of everything you didn't think and you didn't say. If it is true that one is, quote, guilty of the good that they have not accomplished, then that presupposes an entire system of philosophy. But since 99% of the population does not carry an explicit protocol of philosophical maxims, therein lies the rub. So you have the classical dichotomy of the wolf and the sheep, the wolf in sheep's clothing, and now the sheep in wolf's clothing as well. So it's tragic, but these verbal dichotomies, these dualities, may have to repeat themselves until the synergistic dissolution arrives. Otherwise, one as a philosopher would simultaneously have to admit that they would not be a philosopher if not for the current situation, which of course is a multifold and compound tragedy, of which I shall say more later. For the time being, brood on this, stew on this, make your soups out of it, because you must make your soups out of something. And so therefore, one should understand how in every given perspective that is simultaneously a striving, it is from that intentionality of poverty that you come. The reason being is that you are striving. So, mathematically, we begin to make sense, therefore, of the world in the shape as it is today, because you recognize that inequality is not merely a word, it is not merely a political structure, it is not merely that which is a presupposition to what is mainstream. No, inequality is endemic. It does not matter what economic structure. It does not matter the number of inventions. It does not matter the number of geniuses on a certain level, because if it's true 1 in 30,000, well, that means that there are many groups which do not contain a genius. Correct? Correct. All right, so even if they do not, nonetheless, those bell curves are still going to be operative, because insofar as there is a natural order, the bell curves are either extrapolative or they are intrinsic. So from that vantage point, of course, the individuals with the highest processing power are going inevitably to develop complexes if they choose to remain in those quarters which increasingly become confined. Arguably, they become more confined as a result of the iterations of choice that are implicitly or explicitly made. So this has always been fascinating to me, insofar as when the individual does not compel themselves to be fully an outsider, when they still not merely skirt the edges of society, but still somehow seek to gain some sort of foothold, some sort of power position within that structure, okay, but whatever you do is going to be a reflection of the structure that made the potentiality for your thinking possible, even if your thinking was merely a defense mechanism against masses, of which I would argue no thinking is merely that. But in the same way that we read the history of Stoics, it's important to recall from time to time that there is plenty of evidence to suggest Stoicism derived from the rationalization of slavery as such, okay? So, if we are to regard that perspective, the only question, therefore, was, when my master bids me to reach for the double-toed piece of lettuce on the highest shelf beneath the pig's feet, then the only criteria of success is the degree of conformity and the degree of gracefulness within that moment of reaching. So this is why the conceptual apparatus is a liberator and a leader of entrapment, insofar as what is the worth of the people that you are leading? What is the worth of your own mind? If you cannot measure these things, if there is merely an instinctual reaction, so be it, but then recognize that you cannot speak for the world because you have denounced the language of that world. Or you are simply hoarding it for yourself, which, from my perspective, as the goal of self-actualization, however phony, however realizable, okay, it is an ideal. And insofar as that ideal is formulaically formulated within your own mind, insofar as you have a mind that is your own, then Godspeed. But then again, from my perspective, that is one of the foundational questions within philosophy as a crusade is such question: why even initiate? Why even participate in conversation as such in the first place? And if your knee-jerk reaction is to say, but I don't understand, civilization would not be possible without the cross-firing connections. And, well, no disagreement there, but to venture the contours of the wise man, well, what if it is true, therefore, that civilization produces great men and then walks around them, correct? So what does that mean? Well, what it means is this, that in the potentiation of development, of genius, awareness, the inquisitive nature that rebels beyond compulsion, but as a matter of principle, there will always be perhaps the sensitivity of a gray area that if a degree of interference is imposed, then that's it. Your world has ended before it's begun. But who among us is able to pinpoint that exact moment and to dive into that Socrates perspective then? What is a grain of sand? How deep is deep? Etc. And then you realize, well, to ask the question is not the same as to inherit a moral obligation to explain it. No, those moral obligations are imposed by the body language, the acculturation, the imprint of hands which are filthy insofar as they never learned what it was to be clean. There was always a sort of cleanness to them, which was their innocence, right? But then what happens when innocence is lost? And this is a time at which innocence has been lost. Now, this is a problem because it may have been true centuries ago. Okay, we are the elites. We inherited the Aztec monarchy. Not only are we going to regard the study of the magic mushroom, for example, as purely an elitist profession, but you will then never be aware of the results of our experiments until well after your time, right? So then you ask, well, okay, so what did a person in that period of history, what chance did they possibly stand to be able to achieve or to even spell enlightenment, right? And so, and it's such a circumstance and a situation whereby, okay, arguably, if we are born enlightened, if enlightenment and innocence are somehow equivocals, or if enlightenment is somehow an expansion of the intuitive feeling of innocence, then perhaps we would reread our Buddhist scrolls, not as if we had been born for the 1,000th time, but as if we had just been born. And so perhaps that is my misinterpretation. I do not claim to be an expert on the reconciliation between the faiths of the Hindu and the Buddhist, nor do I aspire to be. However, this question about teasing and tickling that which is enlightenment continues to tease and tickle. However, to disregard these enlightenments with capital E, let's say that we don't even want to go there. We simply want to focus and examine. Let's just see what's just on the surface here. Now, I could quote quotes, I could name names, but I've learned from WJS that you don't want to do that. No, you want to stick with the Narragansett method. You want to aspire to contribute anonymously to society. And maybe the reason why he said that, maybe the reason why he asserted that, is because he knew where the future was headed. He knew that even as much as we romanticize those who were of the earth and saw no reason to deny it, to turn their backs upon it, that therefore this was a perfect world. Well, I mean, anyone who has eyes within any era of experience, anyone who um, ever pauses to examine the discrepancies between thought and action, well, within the space is not the philosopher born. And therefore it is fascinating simultaneously to speak to those for whom, oh, in my language, there is no word for respect. Really? Tell me more about that, please. Because I think it's still a matter of debate, and I hope that this debate does not go south or disappear off of the planet anytime soon. But I think there is some question as to the depth and the extent to which the emphasis of language as a shield of concepts actually impacts and sinks into the consciousness which, like a lotus flower, abides the receptivity of information and life itself. So what went wrong? How did we learn how to box in existence? Well, again, this is controversial because if you run the experiment of Kant, okay, well, let's take a behavior, let's universalize this behavior. If everyone was a janitor, if everyone was an electrician or a philosopher, well, you can see none of those solutions would work. Okay, so from that deduction, you might conclude, okay, well, the hierarchy, the division of labor was somehow necessary and inevitable. Again, no disagreement there. But this is so late in history that if you aren't thinking about how to re-coordinate matters, if you aren't thinking about how to creatively coordinate that which has been done 1,000 times before, I mean, that's the definition of a robot. So my question is this: to what extent, I mean, how is it that a human being can successively rationalize something which increasingly becomes that which you're unwilling to rationalize? And doesn't it merely return to this axiom of being an ox and being capable of these burdens, that everything is to be endured and no one has to watch you suffer? You can keep that to yourself. And isn't that what we've done? Isn't that what we've become experts at doing and being, which provides for a very interesting situation in which you have a perfect classical, highly convoluted example of the mind-body dichotomy, because it's not the mind-body dichotomy anymore. It's the mind-body multi-million dichotomy. It's how many ways can you divide consciousness? And if there's another version, or if there's a Frankensteinian palindrome or a zeitgeist or a Pandora's box that comes into existence and more or less is a, quote, alternative category to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, then at this particular juncture I would be surprised, because I don't think that the powers that be would have any need of an alternative, because look at how well the DSM is working out for everyone. I mean, look at how easily, look at how convenient it is to simultaneously inherit a label and therefore to imply not necessarily that this label is the summation of your individuality and your personality and your behavior, but that it is perfectly excusable, it is without subtlety, it is without necessary derogatory interrogation. that one should introduce themselves as this label given the chance. Now, again, this is my question in the postmodern world, and I find myself more reflexive than I want or ought to be, which is that, okay, on the one hand, you know that we've inherited the animal instincts, but on the other hand, it seems like there's still a distinction between that instinct to protect what is perceived as one's own versus the kind of rampant idiocratic reactivity that is part and parcel and symbolic of all the ways in which, if you do look at the cliche timeline of how the attention span seems unwilling to congeal itself after 30, 45 minutes, 4 hours, then, from my perspective, you certainly begin to ask yourself, well, am I even dealing with the same species? You know, is this really the same species? Because what, therefore, is a species? I mean, is a species merely defined by the method by which they reproduce, or is there something more to it than that? Is it about the manner of consciousness of that species? And even then, I mean, the fractals are a wonderful metaphor for all these various shifts, because if it's true, and it certainly is, that wherever you go, there you are, okay, so take that axiom and recognize that wherever it is that you're going is the reset of a central point. And therefore, that it might be wise to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of your responsiveness to that centralized point. And this is why it's very important going forward, whatever forward is, that there is a kind of mystery. That not everything is explained or explainable, because the moment that you portend and provide the illusion that it is all explicable, not merely that, for example, the theory of evolution has some legitimacy, but that you somehow want to entangle yourself within whatever theory you're applying, then you're personalizing the abstraction of your objectivity and will risk, to follow the lines of a wise man, okay, you're setting yourself up as an authority among the gods of truth and falsehood and despair. So from that point on, I mean, if you stick that in your pipe and smoke it, then maybe you can achieve oneness. And I think that this spontaneous rant will serve as my lecture for today. But at the same time, if you look at the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral brain, you can certainly make the deduction or the conclusion that, okay, what if these voices in our heads all those thousands of years ago, what if those voices in our heads that were saying there's some external source were merely the process of the hemispheres separating and specializing? And if that's the case, what were we before? And why does it matter? And for the time being, I think that these thoughts, as elucidatingly melancholic as they appear, is part of the goal that is to be arrived at. Because if it's true that now for the last 100 or 150 years we have stigmatized that which was not stigmatized within the last 1,000 years, namely this inclination that some of us seem to have, this melancholic inclination. And all of a sudden, rather than a canvas of fertility, rather than the bedrock of future genius, we have now outlawed it almost. We've considered it an anomaly. This is something to be medicated, and it is not something to be medicated unless it is simultaneously something to feel ashamed of, like a festering wound. If you've ever seen the movie The Beach, it illustrates this point perfectly. You have this ostensibly perfect place whereupon everyone is harmoniously fulfilling their natural inclinations, and yes, you have rivalry, yes, you have sexual partnerships and such, and competition in that domain, and all the things that flesh and blood are heir to, but you're still celebrating for the most part because you're away from the noise of it all. You think that you have outsmarted the system of civilization as such, and then one day, someone is bitten by a shark, and there's not a doctor available. I'm sorry, the doctor is 200 miles away, and we can only get there by boat. And the gun-wielding, marijuana-growing conquistadors of this place, who would otherwise, be quite low status without their guns, have told us, well, we can't bring any foreigners here because we're going to have to kill you, and we're going to have to end this party. Well, what do you do when you realize that even the sanctuary you've built has eyes upon it, and it doesn't matter whether those eyes were here before you or not, because the asset is the imbalance. And there's a saying in chess: the threat is deadlier than the execution. If you can apply that premise to all situations in life which are diplomatic, then you can recognize the origins of diplomacy. And if you can recognize the origins of diplomacy, you can recognize why nations have boundaries and why the universe is multifaceted. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your homework for tonight's lesson. Thank you.